Good evening, everyone. I'm Chrissy Kelly of Absent, and welcome to the 25th in our series of Tuesday evening webinars. I am delighted to have with me tonight Professor Maria Larsson and Professor Jonas Olofsson, both from the University of Stockholm, from the psychology department. Maria has as a specialty, her interest is in smell memory, and Jonas is interested in smell and dementia, as well as smell training. Also with us tonight, we have Aidan Kirkwood, who will be manning the Q&A bar and taking your questions. So if you have questions about our discussion theme tonight, which is smell memory and what happens to that when we lose our sense of smell, do please put those questions in the Q&A bar, and we would be delighted to talk about them. We try and keep the chat bar for other things. So if you take a look in the chat bar now, you will see that I have put in a link to a questionnaire that Absent has put together. We are asking people on all of our platforms who have lost their sense of smell, how they're doing 1 year into the pandemic. So if you have a minute, we would love to hear you. Let's see, I will, okay, if the link's not visible, I'll make sure that it goes in. Right, so without further ado, Maria, Jonas, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chrissy.
So Maria, let's start with you. And I've heard you speak before in Dresden, and I found your lectures very interesting. Why don't you tell us a little bit about smell memory and odor memory?
Well, where should I start? Well, we can start with saying that when we talk about odor memories, we can have different types of olfactory representations. We can have different types of odor memories. So for example, we might have an odor aversion for a particular food item, for example. We are all carriers of olfactory knowledge. We know the smell of lemon, or we know the smell of cinnamon. And we also do have autobiographical memories, meaning that we have personal memories of various odors that we have encountered in our lives. And when we talk about autobiographical memories, it always has a connection to yourself, and also you can place them at a particular place, location, and also at a particular time. So it's a very complex form of memory.
Yep, interesting. I'm just thinking about one of the things that you mentioned in the lecture that I heard, which was a mnemonic device to remind you had a way of describing all the ways that we fix an odor memory. Would you like to share that with us?
Yes, of course I can do that. Well, we have been doing autobiographical olfactory memory now for over 15 years. And when we started, there were very little evidence of how this form of memory works. But over time, we have learned indeed that these forms of memories are different from representations that we have, or memories that we have for visual or auditory information. And in order to sort of, in order to describe easily how our smell memories differ from verbal, visual, and auditory ones, we created an acronym that we call olfactory LOVER. And LOVER is the key word here. So if you want me to, I can go through what we mean with this olfactory LOVER thing. So shortly, the L in LOVER stands for limbic. Olfactory memories are heavily dependent on limbic functions in the brain. And when I say the limbic system, I mean structures like the hippocampal formation and the amygdala, for example. Hippocampus is very important for the formation of new memories, and amygdala is our emotional center in the brain. So L stands for limbic. Then we have the O, and the O stands for old. And what does that mean? Well, Autobiographical olfactory memories are old memories. They stem from and originates from our first years in life. We have seen in several studies that when we associate an odor to any random event from our lives, we can see that they typically originate from our childhood period. So this is in contrast with what we know for visual and auditory information, in which most memories are formed in young adulthood. So O stands for old. So then we come to the V, and the V stands for vividness. When we experience odor memories, typically these types of memories are highly vivid, they are elaborate, and they are full of details. E, emotion, emotional. When people rate and describe olfactory memories, they say that, well, this is, that they have a very strong feeling of emotion. Quite often it's pleasant. And also they are typically filled with feelings of nostalgia and that you travel in time, sort of. So, and the final letter in the acronym LOVER is R, and R stands for rare. Anecdotally, we think about, or you can read descriptions about olfactory memories, that they are very efficient reminders of past experiences from your life. But this is really not true, because when we look into empirical evidence, we see very clearly that our olfactory personal memories tend to be relatively rare. They are not that common as we see for example, visual memories or auditory associations that we have from our lives. So they are rare. So I hope that you who listen to this will now remember relatively easily how olfactory memories are different from auditory and visual ones.
What's so interesting about your description is, for me, just I'm thinking about all the different parts of my personality that these smell memories reach, and when you paint a picture like that, using this acronym, you see how much the smell memories form part of our sense of self. And I know that, I often say that when we lose our sense of smell, we are losing in some way access to our sense of self. And I wonder what you think about that. And maybe Eunice, if you have a comment on that, I'd like to hear from you.
Sure. Yeah, so I think Maria described it so well, the limbic and emotional and vivid associations that come from smells. It illustrates how the sense of smell provides a very direct link, seemingly very direct link between the external world and our internal world. So whether we are hungry or whether we are nauseated or just the emotional states that we have are so influenced by odors. And yeah, it's a very, those internal states are also close to our concept of who we are, I think. So I think that's why olfaction goes so deep, because it's by nature, it's like an integrative function, as we would call it, when you integrate something that you experience in the outside world with how the inside world is doing. So it seems like olfaction has a very direct connection between the two worlds, so to say.
Yes, and of course, we are here because of smell loss, and so many of the people on our various platforms, you know, this comes up over and over again about the fear of losing access to this autobiographical memory. And obviously, you know, a dozen other issues that have to do with this great personal loss, this loss of sense of self, and will, you know, people become sort of untethered from who they used to be and their past. What do you think about, you know, some people seem to have the ability to recall smell well and easily, and other people can't. Why do you think that is?
Well, I can start if maybe you, Jonas, can comment upon. Well, we have also worked on that topic because that is something that we would call imagery capacity, or our ability to recall or to conjure up an olfactory percept, or the smell of a particular odor in your inner nose, or how I should describe it. And this is a capacity that we see has a huge variation. The individual variation in this capacity is enormous. So some of us are absolutely cannot do this. If I would ask you to imagine the scent of or the smell of cinnamon, for example, some of us would say, no, I can absolutely not do that. I can only see the shape of a cinnamon, or whereas others really can do that. And we can, of course, not be sure that they are able to do that, but we trust them that they are able to do that. And if you have this capacity, you can also, by volition, if you want to, you can also make associations from that imagery or that image that you can create. And by that, you can also make associations to previous episodes or something that you want to remember. And I think it's also important to understand that this is also a capacity that you can train. I mean, if you look at experts, for example, perfumers, chefs, or other people working with their noses, they were not experts from start, but they trained and eventually they learned, because we know that these experts, they are really, really good in this ability.
Let me just ask you a question. Is it possible to image somebody conjuring a smell, thinking about it? Yes, Eunice, that's possible.
Yeah, you mean image in terms of the medical neuroimaging?
Yes, yes. In other words,
Yeah.
can you put people in an fMRI and verify that they are able to, or I mean, perhaps not completely, but get some indication of whether or not they're able to do that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting topic, I think, and in my view, the evidence is clear that that we can evoke patterns of activation in the olfactory cortex from auditory cues or visual cues. And depending on the context, I think these associations or these templates of activity can be more strongly or more weakly activated. There was the initial study on this topic came out already in 1996, if I am correct. A study where participants read the olfactory associated words such as cinnamon, and what the researchers found was that the piriform cortex, the primary olfactory brain, was activated by that. And since then, a number of studies have shown similar results. And what I have done more recently in collaboration with the Christina Solano's group at Northwestern is to look at activity using intracranial measurement. So people who have deep embedded electrodes inside their brains when they are listening to olfactory associated words and they are preparing to smell something. So we gave them a task where they were supposed to match the smell to the name of the smell that they heard before. So it was a type of identification task. And what we could see was that shortly after they heard the word mint or rose, those were the two smells used in that study, there was a type of synchronicity between the olfactory brain and the auditory brain. So they started oscillating in a synchronous way. And there were a bunch of other types of activities that caused us to believe that this thing that you heard triggered the olfactory brain in a particular way, such that it became it actually mimics what happens when you actually smell something. Long story short, the brain gets prepared to smell whatever it is that you anticipate, and then those predictions can be confirmed or rejected. And I think that kind of mechanism is really fundamental to how we perceive smells in our daily lives. Because if we walk into someone's apartment, you know, we have all had this experience that we walk into someone's apartment and it just smells very strange for a few seconds. We get very surprised because we have no real prediction of what it would smell like. But in many cases, we do expect, we had expectations, a little bit like what Maria said with the imagery. I think that can work also in an automatic or implicit way. That the context, if we are in a fine restaurant, we expect it to smell in a certain way. And if it does smell like that, we don't think about it typically. It's when our expectations are violated. That's when it becomes a strange experience.
So can this be linked to smell training then, in this sense of remembering, because you're smelling a jar which you've maybe looked at the label? Can that link to that for people who are anosmic in that sense?
I'm sorry, I couldn't catch the first part of what you said.
I'm wondering whether you know how you're saying you anticipate what something smells like. People who are smell trained have the 4 jars and they can read, if they're looking, what they smell like. Would anosmics, do you think, be anticipating this smell, even though they perhaps don't get a signal? I
think so, yeah. And I think that's probably an under-recognized part of smell training, is that expectation effect. I would like to hear Maria's point of view about that, but I do think that that might have an additional boost.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you say, Jonas, because if you use your imagery capacity, that is that you have something that we call top-down processing. And what is top-down processing? That is when you sort of pick out memories and associations. If you know that you have lemon in front of you, but you cannot exactly perceive the odor of lemon, you can sort of recreate an image, maybe a visual image, and you try to also recreate the scent of it while you are training with the smell. And eventually, if you train long enough and good enough, you will be able to sort of combine the bottom-up process, which is actually when the system is sort of trying to make sense what you are perceiving, with the top-down processing based more on previous experiences and memory, knowledge, and imagery and so forth. So I would say that all training, or all good training, is based on that.
That is interesting. The only reason I was asking, because if you've been anosmics for a certain period of time, are you not expecting a smell when you smell it because you've not smelt something in so long? So how is that? Am I going completely? That's quite. Yeah, it becomes complex then.
Yeah, but if we talk about sort of acquired anosmia, if you get an anosmia due to COVID or something else, head trauma or whatever, an infection, you would still have as opposed to congenital anosmia, for example, when you are born without a sense of smell. If you have an acquired anosmia, you are able to sort of, you have some recollections and knowledge about the identity of various odors and how they should smell. And you could make use of that information also when you train.
What's so interesting now, just listening to you talk, is, you know, how much of our brain we use when we're thinking. You know, we smell with our brains. You know, there's all this stuff going on above, you know, above the cribriform plate. And I think for many people who don't really understand enough about smell training, they think that it's just about what happens between the nostril and the smell training, whatever the odor, whatever the target odor is. And really, it's a highly complex, colorful picture that's happening further up in the brain, and one that really needs to be part of, as you say, the smell training program. I couldn't agree more. Maria, Aidan, do you have a question or two?
Yeah, I've got something. Just as we were speaking about that there, Sally Ann asks, does your brain still receive the signals even though you can't appreciate an odor? An example, if you spray lavender on your pillow but can't smell it, will you still get a peaceful night's sleep? Or will you trick your brain that normal sleep should occur? Now, linalool, I'm sure anosmics can still get the anti-anxiolytic effect of linalool that's in lavender without smelling. Is that true?
Jonas, should you start?
These anxiolytic effects of this is we're going into aromatherapy territory here. I think it's fairly well established that these effects are due to psychological expectations. So our association, so it's actually a very good example of the cognitive effects that we are talking about, in my view, that we have these associations and emotional associations, as Maria said, to lavender, for example, and this will put us in a certain mood because of our prior experiences, because of our expectations, and if it works, it works. But there's nothing especially relaxing about lavender.
This is a learned response, in other words.
Yeah.
Yes, this is also, I think, if you think about, I think you had two questions in there, Aidan, but also to comment upon what you said, Jonas, is you can also think about it if you think about, for example, well, everything, in my view, a lot of our responses to odors are learned responses. It's not that we are pre-programmed to sort of react in a certain way to an odor. So, for example, if I would have associated peppermint as an invigorating substance or smell, I would get more energy from peppermint. But at the same time, I could have also associated peppermint with something that relaxes me while I take a bath or whatever. And I could use peppermint as a way to fall asleep easier and so forth. So that is one thing. But one thing that I'm not sure about, and this is a very good question that she put, was that, you know, even though if you have complete anosmia, you are not able to perceive anything, but you still have an odor in front of you, you are exposed to this odor. Does it affect you in any way? You know, even though you are not consciously aware of that you have an odor in front of you, would it make a difference? So I would say, I mean, given that the high plasticity of the system and that we have regeneration, constant regeneration of nerve cells, I would say that yes, it's a good thing, because somehow these molecules would sort of exercise the receptors and might promote regeneration. But Jonas, maybe you have a better comment to this excellent question, I would say, that she put.
Yeah, would like to just emphasize that there is so much top-down effects in the olfactory system, and so there is so much in the olfactory system has to do with preparing the olfactory system to receive the smell. And that type of activity we can exercise and we can engage with prior to perception, actual perception. So I think that a lot of the work we can do in advance of an incoming stimulus. And we can try to harness those effects to our advantage if we want to become better smellers, irrespective of whether we want to become an expert in perfumery, or if we want to recover or rehabilitate our sense of smell. Play around with expectations and cognitive associations, and monitor your own reactions to what you are smelling. Those types of things I think could be a good exercise.
Yeah. Maybe I should say also, now I'm having an associations. We didn't talk about that much, but I mean, we are also easily fooled. I mean, we are, you might think that when we perceive an odor that you have like a bottom up, you have a certain amount of and a mixture of molecules, and it enters the brain, and then the brain sort of makes sense of it. And then we say that, well, this is tar, or this is, well, whatever. But the thing is that if you orient people, if you are, well, it could be a simple thing that you have a water solution, and then you just add some color in the water solution. And then you ask people to rate the intensity of that solution. I mean, it's only water, but still people would rate it differently as compared to when we only use simple water. And an olfactory analog or to that would be when you work with ambiguous odors, that is odors that could be interpreted in different ways. If you probe people or if you orient them and you say that, for example, this is, I mean, everyone knows this classical example of Parmesan cheese. If you present Parmesan cheese to people and you say, now you will smell some Parmesan cheese, and I want you to rate the degree of pleasantness that you have from it, and people would rate it. And then you provide exactly the same odor, exactly the same Parmesan cheese, and then you say, now I will present you with some vomit, and I want you to rate the pleasantness of that. And you would have huge differences in the perception of the one and same odor. And that, I think, is a very good example of how we are sort of, how top-down processes, expectations and beliefs actually can drive the perception that we have of incoming olfactory information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maria, sorry, Aidan?
And I was just very interested, unless you wanted to go into another question, but it sounds like you were going to follow up.
Let me just ask Maria one question. We spoke before we began this evening's event about you doing a little sort of test, a quiz on everybody that's listening about imagery, the capacity for imagery and imagining something. So would you like to try that out? And once, when we finished, I've got a poll, so I'll ask you a question about that.
So, okay, I would just give the examples now, Chris. This is what you want from me, or? Okay, then I want the audience to imagine that you suck on the corner of a cushion that you have at home, that you would really try to imagine how it feels when you suck on that corner of the cushion. And then I also want you to imagine how it feels like to have a spoon of sand in your mouth. Is that okay?
So are you all thinking about that now? Yes.
I want you all to think about that.
Okay, great. And I'm just going to ask you a simple question about that. Let's see if I can launch this poll. Oh no. Okay, right. Well, then I'm sorry to say that was a fail.
Oh,
Sorry, everyone. I was going to ask you
Uh-oh.
whether you were able to imagine sucking on the corner of a cushion, which the first time I heard that in one of Maria's lectures, I was immediately transported to being 3 years old and or perhaps less than that. One would hope less than 3 years old. So maybe a year old, sucking on the corner of the cushion, and I knew exactly what that tasted like, what that felt like in my mouth. The same thing with the sand. And I'm very sorry that I can't share a poll with you. So I'm imagining the rest of you would have had a similar sort of reaction. Aidan, what about you? Were you able to imagine that?
Well, I only did it last week, so I remember exactly what sucking the end of a pillow is like that. No, I can imagine that more than I've had sand in my mouth before, but I obviously don't like that. But it is a very pleasant experience. It's a really weird one, isn't it? No matter what sort of way you've washed your pillowcase or with what, you just know that's weird.
I mean, the thing is, I think it's very fascinating because when you start to think about it, how do we know that?
Yeah. Well, we
How
know it
come,
because we
I
did.
mean, and to me, it's really like, working with autobiographical olfactory memories, and we know that they stem from the childhood period. Of course, when we retrieve that type of information as adults, we realize that we are carriers of all types of knowledge stemming from different sensory systems. I mean, to have a spoon of sand in your mouth, you can perceive, at least I can, the smell of the sand, the taste of the sand, but also the texture. You have everything sort of in a package. And when we think about kids and when we were kids, I mean, we explore the environment during our first years through our chemosensory systems. This is how we explore the world. Everything should be tasted and smelled and, all of that. This is because taste and smell are the primary systems when we are kids, when we are small. But then this changes as the brain develops over time. I mean, the sense of smell and taste will be sort of subordinate or at least regarded as less important as compared to sight and hearing. But the fascinating thing is, even though we don't think about that in our everyday lives, we still have the knowledge of it. We know about these things. And how come that we know? Because no one told us, of course, how it feels to have a spoon of sand in our mouths. We know it because once we did it.
Fascinating. Right, Aidan, let's take another question.
Sure. Yeah, while we're on the whole sand and beaches and these types of things and places, Deka's asked, is smell also important to our sense of connection with place, with the environment and world around us? Is the geographic importance of smell significant? Does it help locate us?
Should you take that, Jonas?
Well, I think just anecdotally, certainly that is a major part of our experiences of being in a new environment, like the air, the smell of the air. It's an integrated part of traveling, for example. And we talked before we started now today. We talked about swimming, which Chrissy and I are enthusiastic swimmers. But one of the things that I didn't realize when I took up swimming as an adult is the smell of the water is so incredibly profound, and outdoor swimming is, I mean, you can't see much because you're face is below the water mostly, but you can really smell the environment when you have when you're swimming. So that is and it changes. It changes constantly. So that is sort of a new subaquatic olfactory place association that I have learned to appreciate in the last few years. So,
You
but
can
that's
smell
just
underwater then.
yeah. I mean, you have water in your mouth, and you breathe in through your mouth and out through your nose. So the air that that goes through the system goes out through the nose, and I think that's sort of how it works. You come up for air and then you push it out through your nose. So that was sort of a weird tangent, but that was my intuitive association to place associations. But I think we all have distinct smell associations to places that we have traveled to, and I think that's a very
when I was quite a young child, when I was 6, I grew up in the States, and we went to Austria to visit my father's family, and it was the first time I had ever smelled diesel, and also the first time I had ever been in any kind of a building that had a gas flame in it. And I can remember there was this big hot water tank in the bathroom with a little flame that I can still see the flame, and I can hear it sort of whoosh, that sound when it started to heat up. And the smell of that pilot light was also my first experience of smelling, obviously it wasn't escaping in a way that was dangerous, but just tiny whiff of the pilot light just made such a huge impression on me. And then even years later, I'll be somewhere and I'll just be standing behind a diesel something, and I'll just, for an instant, I will be transported back. That's such a strong memory for me, and something that was completely foreign to my, I'd never been exposed before. Right. Let's talk a little bit now about the plight of people who have been, whose sense of smell has been impaired through COVID-19 or indeed any other sort of acquired smell loss. And I am personally convinced that this whole this notion of a top-down effect being as therapeutic as the bottom-up effect. How do you think? My first question to you would be, how do we really explain this to people in a way that they really understand it? Because in the first instance, sometimes people are a little bit, how can that be? So what are your suggestions? What are your top tips for making that, sound really plausible?
You mean now top-down processing? Or?
Yes, how important the top-down process is.
Well, I would say that you use your memory of the particular scent, any association that you have. It could be a personal memory, or it could be a knowledge-based memory. And also at the same time, try to recreate the smell. And if you cannot do that, you should try over and over again. And eventually, with some luck, you will be able to do that. I have met with several people who suffer from acquired anosmia. And many of these people, they said, I remember in particular, a man who told me that he had a severe virus infection, and then he became totally smell blind. And he really suffered from that in the sense that he was really an olfactory oriented person. And he told me that in particular during springtime, when you have all the flowers coming to, you have the snow going away, and you could really feel or perceive the earth is sort of, waking up from a long winter sleep. And he told me this story when the lilac was in bloom, and he stopped, and then he took just a flower from the tree, and then he put it in front of his nose, and then suddenly, from out of nowhere, it was like when he saw the flower, when he saw the lilac, it was like everything came back to him, and it was an image. It wasn't a true sort of perception of the flower that he was holding, but he was successful in recreating. And so he was successful in this association, and eventually he gained he got fully recovered in his sense of smell, but it was gone for almost a year. So I would say, well, top down, you use your previous experiences and you try to link them to what you perceive with your visual system or your auditory.
I mean, to hear it explained that way, I'm thinking to myself, listening to you, what a rich experience, what a rich bouquet of olfactory sort of perceptions there are stored up above. And people who have lost their sense of smell, who are not yet tuned into that, will say, for me, it's a complete blank. And yet they have all these stored memories. They can go the kind of places in their minds that we have just described. And to do that in a way that is instructive and builds on this kind of top-down effect would be, I think, very therapeutic.
I think there is much more research needed on this in general about different modifications of smell training programs, and I think that it's probably an underutilized aspect, the top-down effects and memory effects. But I think that most people who are struggling with perceiving smells, if they would try smelling things that they don't know what it is, just take a random spice from the spice rack without knowing what it is and smelling it, and then doing the same task but actually knowing what it is that they're smelling, I think the experience would be quite different, because we have all these associations. We know what it is supposed to smell, and I think the brain can help the nose to put these missing pieces in place. That would be one way to demonstrate this. If you have a smell impairment, that you can smell some notes perhaps in a complex household smell, but not all of them.
Right. Aidan, do you have any?
Yeah, I was literally just going to say that when you're just pointing out. Yeah, so presumably it's better to smell train with scents you know rather than something you don't really know particularly well. Is that the case, would you say, in the smell training kit that's currently used?
The smells that are currently used are should be familiar to most people. I would assume that would be the case. We still don't know very much about which odors work the best, in what concentrations, or how long or whatever. We're still figuring out a lot of these things, but I would definitely assume that familiar smells are better for the reasons that we have been discussing here.
Yeah,
I totally agree.
Yeah.
And while we're there, Barry, he asks, are some smell memories a memory of smelling something on a previous occasion, or a memory of sights and sounds that the smell has triggered? Has to be a very philosophical question from Barry, as always, but it's a good one. That is a good one.
Yeah, that is a good one.
Sorry, Aidan, I didn't hear your full.
Okay, are some smell memories a memory of smelling something on a previous occasion, or a memory of sights and sounds that the smell has triggered? Ooh,
but it's really there are, I think, 2 studies at least that have tried to look into multimodal cues When we talk about multimodal cues, what do we mean by that? Well, in everyday life, when we have an olfactory memory, rarely you are only presented with the odor only, because we are, living in a very complex context. We are constantly encountering visual information, auditory information, and mixed up with that, we have an odor. So it's a very good question, if I understand the question correctly. And I mean, in work that have, looked into that, it seems like the odor often becomes sort of subordinate. It doesn't drive the recollection. It's a visual information primarily that drives the recollection. But in some cases, when there is a perfect match between the odor, previous context, and the temporal part, you will have this fully blown autobiographical Proustian type of olfactory memory. But these are rare. But I can provide Barry with some references if he would like to dig more into that.
Maybe I can add something to that, because when we lecture about smell and memory, it's a simple experiment that everyone can do is just to try to imagine a smell. And so when I ask students to imagine the smell of an apple, two things typically happen. One is that you hear, when 100 students do that at the same time, that seems to be the motor response. The sniffing response is important to imagine smells. And without that, with if you have a nose clip or something, it's very hard for people to imagine even very common smells if you can't make air flow through your nostrils. And that is also shown in brain imaging studies, that the olfactory brain does not become as activated if you can't smell.
We did a study on that, Jonas. Do you remember that? It was like 10 years ago, but only behavior. We used a nose clip.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, right. And that was this line of work was started by Noam Sobel, we should say, who did the early neuroimaging work, which was fascinating, and we and others have found similar things. But the second thing that happens is after people have been sniffing, I typically ask the students, did you see an apple? And everyone says yes. And I didn't ask them to imagine how the apple looks like. I asked them to recall the smell, but yet everyone visualizes an apple, even though that was not the instruction. So we are so visually oriented that the olfactory component of these mental images, we even call them images by visual analogy. So smell has a subordinated role, whether it's cultural or biological somehow. That is something that we should mention in this context, that a lot of the smell associations become unraveled via vision.
We can also think about, Jonas, about dream reports. When we ask people, about the sensory content in dreams, and you can see that only the prevalence of olfactory content in dreams is about 5%. And we have a huge visual dominance when we dream at night. Mostly derived from, the visual system. Very few of us have actually olfactory content in the dreams. Mostly experts and people who are really interested in smells would.
Yeah, I weirdly have it. I once had a dream, because I'm self-trained in perfumery. This was actually before I woke up from a dream, and I actually smelt a perfume in my dream that doesn't exist, and I've never smelt it. And I can still recall what it smelt like. And I thought, you know, I should actually recreate what that was. And I was like, maybe I have smelt it before, maybe it was something, but it was the weirdest experience ever. But yeah.
Was it a pleasant smell?
Yeah, it was kind of musky. Yeah. So there we are.
Interesting.
But
That's very interesting.
Just listening to you talk and looking at my list of points that I had prepared for this evening, I wanted to mention or talk a little bit about the emotionality of smell and smell memory. And in particular, one of the things that people say a lot in the various forums is that without smell, the emotion sort of starts to drain away, that you begin to feel very flat. And I'm just wondering, you know, if you think that is just the logical effect of losing your sense of smell, that you lose access to this emotionality. What would you say about that?
Well, there is fairly robust evidence indicating that if you lose this sort of olfactory stimulation or perception of odors, that you also run the risk of having more depressive symptoms. And I think this is something that you should take very seriously, because Ilona Kroy did some really wonderful work on that. And we know more and more about also this sensory system as something that, I mean, this is an emotional sensory, it's an emotional system. So if you sort of cut off that stimulation, it will have some negative repercussions for you. What we don't know, and also thinking about what we discussed previously, is whether if you could train through previous experiences by imagery or other methods, this could maybe sort of prevent to a certain extent the development of these types of problems. Also, I hear very often people perceive themselves as living in a bubble. It's like they are disconnected from everything. And of course, this is horrible.
Yeah, I think the work that you are doing, Chrissy, with the Facebook group, the research that you are doing with participants there, gives really interesting results about how intimate the sense of smell is, and how it gives you a sense of being part of your environment. And it's some people describe it as living in black and white, or watching the world pass by on a screen. It's really a sense of a disconnection, and this is I think it's very hard for people who have a well-functioning sense of smell to understand, and that's part of the problem also, that people report, if I understand it correctly, they don't feel heard or seen.
People say over and over again, you know, no one can understand, and it's indescribable. And, you know, I've been living with some level of smell dysfunction for almost 9 years now, and I haven't found an adequate way of describing it either. I just find it's so alien and so peculiar to not have any feedback about your environment. It's like looking into a mirror and then not seeing a reflection. And this is so very odd and destabilizing.
Well,
Aidan, a question.
While I was speaking about feeling, you know, alien and alienated, about mental awareness. Yeah, someone's asked here, well, says, it's really good to hear Marie and Jonas talking about the mental and emotional connections between smell memory and personhood. A lot of the material and advice available about COVID smell and taste loss seems to focus on its impact on eating and drinking. Is any work being done to look at the emotional and mental health impacts of smell loss, and how people experiencing negative impacts can be helped?
Well, I think I can quickly jump in and answer that, Claire. That is something that we're looking at right now. I think if the survey that I put into or that Aidan put into the chat bar, which is looking at how people are feeling into their COVID-19 smell loss, has shown us so far that the kind of responses that we get when we ask people, they're all about mental health. They're, no one at this point is expecting a miracle cure, but people are really struggling with the everyday mental health aspects of living, this disassociated life. And really the food and drink is just kind of like the tip of the iceberg. And the rest of it is unseen and immeasurable. And it can't be described. So we are looking at that right now, Claire, and we will report on that as soon as we have something to have a new webinar about. Okay, I think, well, we're getting to the end, unfortunately. I'd like to bring up something that Jeanette mentioned. Aidan, do you want to read that one?
Mm-hmm. Jeanette here said, just at the start of the webinar, I found that some of my safe foods have come about from a nostalgic memory of food from my childhood. For example, pasta with cheese, but it's odd that it doesn't work for all foods. Yeah, that'd be a Jane Parker question, but yeah, it's
yes, it
it's
would
good.
be. Yeah. People often report pasta and cheese being something that is palatable and probably doesn't have quite all of those active compounds in it, which are turning people off of meat and coffee and so on. But Jeanette, I'm glad you found at least a couple of things that you can eat. Let's have a couple more questions and then I think we'll have to call it a day again.
Mm-hmm. Is it possible to only smell, even for just a moment, a whiff of a familiar nostalgic smell, but smell nothing else or no other odors? Is that just a smell memory smelling it? Or does it mean that smell is returning bit by bit? So sort of fleeting whiffs, is this what this sort of question is?
Yeah, yeah.
People do say that during recovery, this is fleeting whiffs.
Yeah.
Then I think for those who are experiencing that, they do have some level of general smell function. So it's probably, there are probably a number of different receptors that are online, so to say, but not all of them are fully recovered. But they come sort of in patches, so to say.
Yep. Good. Let's see. Oh, okay. We have Sina who says, I agree about my loss of smell causing emotional access. I am afraid I will lose my smell memory after 1 year of COVID. 100% loss of smell. I do feel flat emotionally and isolated. I'm so sorry, Sina. I know you often come to these webinars and I do feel for you. I've been there, and so I know how difficult it is. But I hope that this evening you have learned that you still have a lot of smell memories stored, and you can make use of those by dwelling on them, thinking about them, and maybe finding some way of smell training with things that remind you of those events in your life. Right, well, I'm afraid we've come to the end of another fascinating webinar. I would just like to remind you that in 2 weeks, I will be here with Bob Pellegrino of the Manel Center and Marha Veldhusen, who, and I hope she'll forgive me, I have forgotten the name of her university in Turkey. They will be talking to me about traumatic brain injury and smell loss. So that will be a little bit different from the usual COVID-19 fare. So I hope that you join us for that. And it is just left for me to say thank you to Maria and Jonas for joining us this evening. Thank you, Aidan, and we will see you in 2 weeks. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank everyone. Thanks.
Yeah.
Take care. Bye.
Goodbye,
Bye.
everyone. Good night.